Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second last Data Then and Now talk of the year. Um, Data Then and Now, for those who don't know, is a historical lecture series on data, co-organized by the eScience Institute, Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering, the iSchool, and the Science, Technology, and Society Studies program at University of Washington. So today we are very happy to have Andrew Ventimiglia virtually here to speak to us. His talk we call Open Source Religion, Text Mining, and the Production and Ownership of Religious Data, 1955 to 2010. So Andrew Ventimiglia is Assistant Professor of Mass Media in the School of Communication at Illinois State University. Dr. Ventimiglia's research focuses on the history and cultural effects of intellectual property law in the United States. And his first book, Copyrighting God, Ownership of the Sacred in American Religion, was published by Cambridge University Press last year in 2019. Dr. Ventimiglia has a PhD in cultural studies from the University of California, Davis, and has also worked as a postdoc research fellow at University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. So thank you, Andrew, for being here.
Not a problem, thanks.
Looking forward to this.
Yeah, of course. So shall I jump in?
Yeah, you're good to go.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks everyone for coming. Most of my classes have been asynchronous, so I'm not a Zoom pro, but I will just give it a go. And I told James, people could interrupt if they needed to. So I suppose if there's something urgent or it's something totally incoherent, you can drop a question in the Q&A and we can try and get to it. But otherwise, I'll just talk. So as James mentioned, my area of research, let's see, I'm going to get my notes in a proper spot. My area of research and background is media studies and cultural studies. And as he mentioned, the focus on the history and cultural effects of intellectual property. So mainly copyright, bit of trademark, and doing some more recent stuff on patents. But the origins of this particular project did come from the dissertation, which then became the book Copyrighting God. And that book was about really looking at the complexities of claiming copyright in sacred and prophetic texts. Particularly focusing on the tension between control, right? The control that religious organizations could assert through copyright, and countervailing imperatives to circulate prophecy or gospel as divine truth. So questions of divine authorship, the weird ways that the law gets turned to other ends, things like that. And so on the periphery of this was also an interest in other dimensions of copyright and sociality, right? So the way copyright could organize social communities and social organizations. So open source and free software communities and that kind of discourse was always on the margins of what I was looking at. So the work I'm presenting today comes from the general interest around IP, but is really focused specifically on the ownership and circulation of spiritual media or data online. So that's kind of the mini genealogy of this project. And I tweaked the title a little bit because spiritual genealogy of text mining somehow seemed to be promising too much. I don't know, so I scaled it back a little bit. But okay, so this is our map for the presentation. And let's see, there we go. So I'll move as quickly as possible through these 6 sections outlined here. And the narrative that I'll be constructing is relatively linear, the historical narrative that moves through developments in religious software. And this project was, the plan was to build a media history and chronology of Christian Bible software developed in the United States between 55 and 2010, and focusing on the different ways that Bible software and pastoral programming adopted text mining and kind of innovated in those areas. There's been some scholarship in this area, especially in the last few years. A book called Liquid Scripture and other work on kind of Bible apps, but it's still relatively underexplored. Even though, as I mentioned in the abstract, Often people talk about the origin of the digital humanities with this Jesuit priest, Roberto Bussa, and his projects. So there's this kind of weird, religious origin, and then it kind of falls out of the picture and when talking about digital humanities and digital media histories. So I wanted to tell this story in order to get to at a few kind of interrelated questions. First, given the origins of humanities computing with Jesuit priest Roberto Bussa, what role did religious practice and ideation play in the history of digital media and the digital humanities, specifically with text mining software as a kind of central technology here? In other words, was Bussa's role just a historical quirk, or did it indicate that religion has played an understudied and underappreciated role in digital media history? Second, how did emerging religious software companies approach questions of ownership and control over the religious data produced and circulated on their platforms? And I'd say this is the component that other kind of tentative histories in Bible technology have not really attended to. And then third, how did those matters of data ownership reflect theological orientations to the text or spiritual practices linked to textual distribution and analysis? In this respect, I was uniquely interested in interrogating whether religious orientations and techniques might lead programmers, particularly religious programmers, to being early adopters and innovators of text mining technologies, which would in turn shape religious practice and the form of something I've tentatively called open source religion, or the production of religious data as a spiritual commons circulating without regard for the attribution of authorship and ownership. So that's where we got the Chris Kelty reading that I suggested. Okay, so to begin, text mining can be defined as the discovery by computer of new, previously unknown information by automatically extracting that information from different written resources. Key applications of text mining include things like stylistic analysis or stylometrics, recognition of patterns across sets of text, and the search for kind of stylistic markers for authors, leading to authorial attribution in historical and literary works, the Shakespeare type stuff. And text mining depends first, of course, on the identification and digital conversion of large textual data sets that can be subjected to computational analysis. So the original application of computing to the analysis of literary text came from just such a need to analyze a large corpus. This was the collected works of St. Thomas Aquinas. Jesuit priest Roberto Bussa, long identified as the father of humanities computing, and they have the Digital Humanities Award named after him. And Stephen Jones is a historian who's written a book on Bussa. Bussa approached Thomas Watson, the founder of IBM, in 1949, in order to develop a project tagging and indexing the entirety of Aquinas' output. Bussa's project eventually resulted in a 56-volume work, the Index Thomisticus, that totaled 65,000 pages. While Bussa is often recognized as the father of digital humanities, the religious motivations for his project are less interrogated. They're not, at least not featured kind of centrally in narrations of his role in digital humanities. But his turn to text mining technologies should be understood as uniquely motivated by spiritual concerns. Religious studies scholars Chris Cantwell and Hussein Rashid have noted that Bussa requested the use of IBM's punch card technology after discovering that Aquinas' conception of God's holy presence was always preceded by some use of the preposition in, which I guess suggested to him some kind of insight into Aquinas' Eucharistic theology, which talks about the enveloping presence of God in the Eucharist. So, but this observation, this kind of foundational observation, led him to wonder what else a searchable catalog of Aquinas' writing might reveal. And additionally, historian Stephen Jones has noted that Jesuits as a community, were uniquely suited to this shift to computer-assisted text analysis. The standard method of instruction across Jesuit colleges was, and I quote from Jones' book, was close textual analysis, taking text apart word for word, which interestingly in the 16th century would often be referred to as anatomization, a term that connects in interesting ways to the idea of atomizing or dissolving the texts in computer-assisted indexing. End quote. But one might also note that beyond the Jesuits, religious innovators, particularly those in evangelical traditions in the US, have long deployed technological inventions to spur religious understanding or facilitate religious communication and outreach. Historian David Nord has described a long tradition of spiritual innovation, specifically in print and distribution technologies. For instance, of course, kind of the kind of cruder narrative of the Reformation and the relationship to the printing press. But American revivalists also famously utilized print technology to expand their reach through the development of things like the American Tract Society and the cheap mass production of supplementary materials like that. So the American Tract Society and other local Bible societies worked to spread religious media by developing innovations that included the Cole Porter system, so door-to-door salesman, essentially, dynamic pricing, so varying prices of the Bible down to zero, depending on the consumer, not giving it away for free, because that would, anyway, and stereotype printing as well, so real technological developments. So the computer thus fits into this longer lineage of media tools repurposed, or one might simply say purposed for religious ends, right? There's really no repurposing going on here, because it's kind of, religion continues to be at the foundation of some of these developments. Another important precedent facilitating the computational analysis of religious texts was the longstanding practice of developing concordances, or indexes for the Bible. Concordances are specifically alphabetical indices listing every occurrence of a word in a text. And this type of practice began with the Bible as early as the 13th century and was designed to facilitate exploration and analysis of the text, particularly by allowing the cross-references of passages using the same words that would otherwise kind of escape, the memory, even the best memory of a human. You'd have to have these kind of reference guides to find these unusual and kind of profound connections across the text. And the production of concordances themselves, while very tedious, of course, were recognized as religious. In other words, the labor involved was presumed both to facilitate sophisticated Bible research, analysis, and interpretation, but was itself a kind of laboring with the text, especially in monasteries, kind of connected to the manual reproduction of manuscripts, right? So the really systematic analysis of a text itself was religious. And concordance projects, even more recent ones, quote unquote, 19th and 20th century, was dedicated to completeness, simplicity, and accuracy, as demonstrated here in the most famous English language concordance, the Strong's Concordance. Further anticipating future developments in Bible software and text mining more generally, in 1903, Army Chaplain Orville Nave published one of the earliest complete topical concordances, organizing the Bible into over 20,000 topics and subtopics. These topic tags included, and they're listed here, some on this cover, proper names and places, but also references to various dimensions of history, law, politics, and other secular subjects, archaeology, the arts, sciences, philosophy, et cetera, et cetera. So topical concordances also created this elaborate system of cross-references to both kindred and antithetical subjects, right? So they were kind of creative in the ways that they were linking different scripture, with wide scope given to each topic so that pastors and scholars could investigate connections across disparate passages and across scripture. So Bible concordance projects were thus a natural fit for the cataloging and sorting capacities of early computers, even if the application of modern technologies to traditional religious practices often appeared incongruous, at least in the 50s when this was first developed. So for instance, the most one that was just after Busa, but really has not gotten as much attention, was the work of this American Reverend John Ellison, who developed the first electronic concordance of the Revised Standard Version of the Bible. And Popular Science covered it here in 1956, and really described it in these kind of grand terms as a revolution, industrial revolution, and New Testament studies. Even though it made a clear distinction between human tasks and the operation of the computer, which they repeatedly calls an electronic moron, as you can see there. So there's this kind of ambivalence about the incorporation of technologies, even though it's reproducing traditional modes of textual analysis in some ways. So here we see Reverend Ellison in photographs from a Life magazine article, with the materials Ellison produced to create the concordance. Pretty cool images, I think. And like his predecessor, Roberto Busa, Ellison's interest in religious computing emerged because he noted that biblical scholars spent a considerable amount of time sorting and comparing biblical words, and that a computer could do the same job of sorting and comparing without the risk of human error. Ellison's work in this area is notable because even though they say they were using the Bible to kind of phase out human error, he also recognized that his programming work involved training the computer to do things that, as he quote, had always required human judgment and that had earned honorary degrees for highly trained minds. The main thing that the computer was doing was simply identifying how much of a sentence or phrase should be extracted and displayed in the concordance. So it was identifying what were meaningful chunks of scripture as they related to the individual words being cataloged. So anyway, so that's kind of what the programmers were working on. But as he noted, just because the computer was tasked with the clerical chore of organizing and sorting biblical text, these practices, like the manual production of concordances before it, were themselves religious. Organizing, sorting, and classifying scriptural texts were historically considered practices through which religious exegetes gained intimacy with the Word of God, and close, rigorous, even tedious engagement with religious media, be it textual or then computational in nature, could provide a critical site for the production of spiritual knowledge. So this lineage continued as an important tool for the academic historical study of the Bible. And while the Bible would remain, the kind of critical text, of course, anchoring all these digital experiments, new projects after those developed by Busa and Ellison utilized the increased computational abilities of computers to expand the scope of materials subject to analysis. So Reverend Ellison began, his next project was the collation of 800 variant Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, which he was doing supposedly to design a neutral text that could be used to resolve controversies over divergent versions and interpretations. But then he gets into this whole battle about interpretation anyway, of course. Others like University of Pennsylvania professor Robert Kraft developed computational studies, including morphological analysis of Jewish scripture in Greek, as well as projects to digitize variants of the Greek Septuagint for dissemination. So while these studies were anchored in analysis of the Bible, their incorporation of variant historical texts and translations demonstrated an understanding that biblical text was always changing, making traditional textual analysis insufficient for modern biblical scholarship. So again, this is a continuity. That was well recognized in Bible scholarship for a long time, and computers were increasingly suited to deal with these a wide range of translations, do the work of comparison, et cetera. So all this scholarship illustrated, in the words of textual scholar David Parker, that every translation is different, every reading is different, and although there's been a tradition in parts of Protestant Christianity to say there's a definitive single form of the text, the fact is you can never find it. Okay. So the future of text mining was increasingly to train itself, or to train programming on larger data sets, what was to become a spiritual commons from which religious meaning could be discerned through the careful application of computational technique. This approach required the collection and digitization of an increasing database of religious texts, sermons, commentaries, tracts, hymns, etc., that could function as a useful and ever-growing repository of spiritual data from which to draw insight. We might note here, again going kind of back in time to go forward, that the expansion of software to include other forms of spiritual text alongside and kind of informing the Bible has a long history itself in relationship to religious print culture. Candy Gunther Brown describes American religious print culture and Christian evangelical print culture in particular as a fluid canon that included a wide range of works designed to recognize and reinforce religious identity. Of course, the Bible is kind of a totemic, right? But understandings of religion and religious practice always was informed by all these additional materials from tract societies on. And Brown also writes of early American evangelicals that evangelicals assumed the text did not belong to their authors, but to the Christian community. And members of this community could appropriate any printed matter for particular purposes. This understanding of text contributed to the fluidity of the canon and the disregard of copyrights. So that kind of thing, of course, is what piques my interest. So the proliferation of evangelical media continued beyond print. So at the same time as there was this early flowering of Bible research tools in the 70s and 80s, there was also the spread of tape ministries as part of a range of evangelical experiments to increase the availability and diversity of media materials, both for conversion, to general audiences, but also specifically for an emerging kind of market for pastors, where pastors could draw inspiration from this kind of these materials. The Wall Street Journal here has this article from 1972, investigated a growing number of firms selling canned sermons to pastors to deliver to their congregations rather than writing their own. For as little as $25, this is the quote, you, like maybe 40,000 other ministers and priests across the country, can buy a batch of canned sermons that will last you a year. So this report sketched the outlines of an emerging sermon market, and there have been other kind of texts exploring some of this stuff that utilize consumer media technologies like audio cassettes and photocopiers, devices that facilitated the increased circulation and distribution of religious materials in a manner, sorry, in a manner that paralleled early efforts by American tract societies and other evangelical organizations to widen the reach of Christianity in the United States. And I nearly ran out of water. So the legacy, here we go. The legacy of these weekly sermon publication firms continued with the emergence of early online sermon databases. Again, they were corresponding with, or kind of a little bit later, of course, than the academic application of computers to Bible study. These were clearinghouses, large depositories of sermons from a wide range of dates and denominational perspectives, with names like DesperatePreacher.com. And this looks like old school. This is actually the current. I just pulled this cover from a couple days ago. So it looks like it's from the 90s, but it's not. With searchable texts and keywords that allowed for clustering based on biblical passage or sermonic theme. For pastors operating in a profession that does not necessarily value originality and theological argument, the need for this kind of cheap market in sermons or public domain sermon repository as fuel for ongoing creative endeavor was acute. So while biblical researchers were honing computational skills for high-level analysis, another demand for text mining, or something like that, was emerging or being newly recognized within the pastoral community. Because sermons, excluding those written by celebrity pastors or historical luminaries, say, that are traditionally published, sermons generally escaped the traditional publication market and were not often copyrighted, and often were, I have that other thing on sermon stealing, and it's a whole complicated issue, but sermons and other types of secondary religious materials offered useful and widely accessible data for enterprising religious software developers. Online sermon databases recognized and captured the value of sermons in aggregate, and emerging commercial Bible software provided innovative search mechanisms and interfaces to capitalize on that latent value of massive quantities of religious data. This strategy was probably first recognized by the Dallas Theological Seminary that had a kind of, so it was a hybrid academic commercial project. As you can see, they worked with some Microsoft employees. And they developed the CD Word Interactive Bible Library, which coupled their work to digitize the Bible with an effort to enrich it with commentaries, dictionary definitions, scholarly exegesis, thus building a hermeneutical apparatus around the Bible as a base text. Professor W. Hall Harris has written of this early commercial Bible software. They said the software functions as a collection of integrated books and reference tools, and searches get a bit more complicated because they have to work across whole categories of books, not just the Bible. So the software, CD Word in particular, would be sold to Logos Research Systems and was one of the earliest forms of commercial Bible software, eventually evolving into the industry-leading Logos Bible software. I'll get back to Logos in a second, but this is just to give you a sense. After the success of CD Word, the 90s witnessed an explosion of Bible software, many of which are around today. So this included highly professional digital libraries of religious material, to software that included multimedia accompaniments to the biblical text, virtual tours of the Holy Land, etc. Other leading commercial software developed around this time included the things here: Word Search Bible software, Concordance Bible software for Macintosh, BibleWorks, and Olive Tree software, which was the first to develop programming for Palm and BlackBerry devices. Competition in the field of Bible software then was not only based on software's usability and effectiveness, but also on access to and interoperability of quality content. So we'll get that, there we get into the standards question. But just to give you a sense of the different types of material here, Logos Bible software is the industry leader. And again, it's based on the programming, but also access to quality content. Over 25,000 titles that they developed through contracts and licensing with major religious publishers, in addition to the stuff they could get via kind of public domain, old school commentaries. But of course, then they created proprietary software on top of that, designed to facilitate user navigation and the capacity to navigate through extensive materials. This is basically what a format looks like, or what the interface looks like of contemporary Bible software. And again, so it involves the user navigating a whole bunch of different types of material based on their search, their choice of search. And the value is, of course, in the sheer quantity of resources it's amassed that can then be kind of organized and navigated through by the user. The massive text that was generated and that was behind the software was best used not by the consumer singling out one single text at a time, of course, but rather searching for everything available on a topic or passage and finding the meaning kind of embedded within. And just to give you another sense of different projects at the time, more contemporary projects, this is a WordBloom software, which has a lot of kind of interlacing of different types of religious data, but all are organized and manipulated through a patented software system. So their patent is really interesting. And they actually fizzled out. So this is more like talking about, genealogies. This is like a media archaeology type. This is a deadline. WordBloom kind of faded out a few years ago. But this is also, these are the type of things they tried to do. More complex forms of textual visualization and interfaces that evidenced a similar approach to managing text in aggregate. So developing market battles between all these different forms of religious software also played out on the level of file standardization, as certain actors attempted to create and sustain proprietary industry standards alongside their proprietary programs to be shared by all Bible software. But the first project was a kind of industry-wide consortium effort to develop an industry file standard specifically for religious data. This was organized by a developer named Craig Reardon, who created the Bible Software Industry Standards Group in order to develop this template, the STEP template, standard template for electronic publishing. STEP was designed to be a uniform format so that Christian books suitable for Bible software could be used in the same way by various programs and vendors. And the STEP standard was designed to facilitate the growth of the industry by building these alliances between manufacturers and basically contributing to the stabilization of the industry, focused on core companies who are all involved in the development of industry norms. Hence this quote, right? Like a lot of work on standards, the value as recognized here is not just in the file structure or indexing mechanisms, but rather in the unique consortium which created and supported it. The STEP file was designed to facilitate all those all those mechanisms of contemporary Bible software, facilitating the user's capacity to search through materials. So it was basically a system of tags that attached to a base rich text format file, an RTF file. And these control words would be shared by all files and would assist in the mechanics of synchronization, searching, and cross-referencing central to Bible software's function. These tags included categories such as glossary, for definitions, Bible, the kind of formational one for links to the Bible, although the STEP conversion program did that automatically, right? Its kind of foundational thing was automatically tagging scriptural references, and language for links to different translations and concordance, etc. So this format treated individual religious texts not necessarily as autonomous works, but rather as that set of interlinked resources or spiritual data. The STEP format then facilitated interoperability, and it led to the effect that each text's value was not in the quality of an individual writer's prose or the clarity of a particular translation, but again, its value was in the aggregate, a collective set of materials that the user would navigate through according to their own interests and goals. While the Bible Software Industry Standards Group was an important moment of consolidation, and it demonstrated the kind of maturing of an industry as a commercial industry, alongside the academic approaches. The STEP standard ended up being abandoned. Other industry leaders like BibleSoft and Logos, again, decided not to participate, and Logos went so far as to make a strong stand against supporting STEP, and it created its own format and data management system, the Libronix digital media system, as part of its efforts to strengthen its own market position. So in response, some developers advocated for an open standard for religious resources utilized in Bible software. For instance, the Word Search Bible created its own Christian Reference Open Software Standard, or the CROSS format. Meanwhile, Calvin University computer science professor here, Harry Plantinga, designed a separate markup language, theological markup language, THML, as a royalty-free format for theological texts designed for his own Christian Classics Ethereal Library, developed in 1993. And Plantinga specifically wrote, I don't know if the quote is actually visible there, but he wrote, commercial formats, including STEP and the Logos library system, are not designed for integration with the internet. Preparing these texts takes expensive software, et cetera, and publication is then controlled by a company or consortium in question. So this resulted in too many religious texts not being publicly available online. So it was one of the reasons for developing this. However, these developers recognized that open standards meant little if the major commercial Bible programs were fully proprietary and often exceedingly expensive, as Logos Bible software was. So these factors in turn encouraged the development of low-cost alternative freeware and open source software designed to provide the same range of services, but based on models of ownership that embraced openness and accessibility as not only economically, but theologically expedient. In other words, just as religious approaches to textual analysis provided fertile ground for the collection, collation, tagging, and organization of texts for data mining, so too did religious orientations toward dissemination of texts, in this instance, the gospel, make Bible software a suitable technology for open source communities. The open source Bible software movement described the project of developing free, fully transparent software that could handle different types of religious data as an explicitly evangelical project. One of the most influential organizations was this one, the Crossware Bible Society, which is still going strong. This collaboration project was initiated as early as 1982, but it aimed to develop cross-platform open source tools under a GNU general public license so that Bible societies could write Bible software more easily and access a greater range of readers. The society described itself here, in explicitly evangelical terms, as an organization with the purpose to sponsor and provide a place for engineers and others to come and collaborate on free open source projects aimed at furthering the kingdom of our God. Considering themselves a digital legatee of the original American Bible societies, but with even greater reach, the digital reach, they wrote, instead of having a geographical domain, Crosswire's domain is software users, predominantly the global internet, or anyone we can reach across the wire. Our scripture distribution compares with the largest of the Bible societies listed. Their interfaces are relatively comparable to the commercial. This is, obviously a kind of more old school one. This is eSword. Actually, there's lots of swords, but this is actually a different one, which was a freeware program downloaded in excess of 25 million times by 2013. Describing the history of his efforts, the programmer Rick Myers wrote, "The Holy Spirit chose to give me the gift of teaching, which I've been using since 1991. It was at the same time that he gave me the desire to program computers. 9 years later, God combined my passion for his word and my pleasure of programming, and eSword was birthed." These programs have been interpreted then as challenging the closed proprietary logic of commercial Bible software by fostering collaboration at the level of production, as multiple programmers continue to develop open source software, while also allowing users to write their own texts and share them with others, enabling pastors to circulate sermons or readers to contribute study notes and commentary. Thus, for some, the governing ethos of the open source movement shared deep affinities with religious approaches, even the economic model of the church, which operated off this kind of, gospel imperative. The open source Bible software movement then represents the culmination of a spiritual genealogy of text mining. This is just their wiki wiki developers page that's currently in operation. So this open source software movement is one that successfully aligned religious methods for collecting and interrogating interrelated religious texts, sermons, and commentaries with technological text mining capabilities, while simultaneously nurturing the living church as manifest in both creators and users of religious text mining programs. Thus we get to Chris Kelty, right? In this sense, religious software developers, particularly those in the developing open source community, epitomized, in my opinion, what Chris Kelty calls a recursive public, a public that's constituted by a shared concern for maintaining the means of association through which they come together as a public. Religious programmers were uniquely positioned to capitalize on the potential of text mining to create new forms of spiritual community through the development and application of computational modes of analysis, applying traditional methods of discernment to growing sets of religious data, and finding in the complexity of digital noise the guiding traces of spiritual signal. And I think that is where we can conclude. I can share some slides. These are just the kind of potted version of my conclusions, right? So religious scholarship played this role because of a number of different connections, familiarity with the compilation of materials, tagging, et cetera. And then of course, and then finally, them being a unique example of a recursive public. So with that, I thank you. And there's my book as a plug. Thanks so much.
Amazing stuff. Thank you so much, Andrew.
No problem.
That was a very interesting talk, and I think that's two fields being brought together that many people have not considered and did not know anything about that. If I could speak for myself. So we have one question already waiting here in the Q&A, and that is from Leah Fulmer, which is, could you please define religious programmer a bit more? Is that anyone who programs with respect to religious texts?
Yeah, thank you. I saw it blink earlier, and I could have. I just wasn't sure if I should break up my flow. Yeah, I mean, there's. So it's interesting. For me as a media studies person, I try to start with the technology and think about the kind of so originally kind of print technologies and the legal mechanisms for that, and then society as the effects on people as being, I guess it's kind of Keplerian, after the technology. It's a little bit technological determinist. So in that respect, I almost try to avoid thinking about the motivations of programmers. But clearly, when I get to the open source programmers, I'm talking about programmers with evangelical commitments that understand technologies to be suitable tools for furthering this evangelical project. But of course, I'm using religious programmer too broadly because the Jesuits don't really fall on that, and they're like denominational and religious nuances here that I'm kind of glossing over. So that so I guess that's to say, by the end of it, I feel like I'm using religious programmer in the sense that you're pointing. In the sense that they have a religious commitment that they're applying to and using technology for. But then I don't know if every technology that I look at is the product of a religious programmer in that sense. In other words, these commercial Bible software companies have large teams, not all of which are going to have the same type of evangelical commitments, and imagine the technology to be doing the same thing. So I guess that's just to say I need to think about the term carefully, because I'm kind of combining a lot in that gloss there.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I guess if I can just go off that question a little bit more.
Yeah.
Is there any generalization about just the backgrounds of the people that are doing this? Are they working? Are they people who work in church or in ministerial roles or not?
I mean, every programmer that I kind of identify here, I would say, is pretty explicitly has a kind of close to a formal religious role. And that I think they would all admit informs their programming practice, right? So again, the open source one is the most obvious. Busa, he wasn't, he was working with Aquinas, but he wanted to be legitimate in the eyes of traditional computer programmers. And so he didn't, I don't think Busa was, I haven't done the work like Stephen Jones has about like really looking at the full archives, but I think he wasn't as upfront about saying, his project was specifically motivated by religious concerns. And in fact, that was one of the things, the one quote that I have about Busa talking about his motivation for that is from one of the only religious studies scholars that I know that have kind of touched on Busa more, because Busa is usually just dealt with kind of quickly in a digital humanities history. So part of that was looking for the religious component of even programmers that are working on the software and don't own up to the way that programming is manifesting a religious goal or project. Yeah, I feel like I'm just like making it less clear, but that's
no.
there
I don't.
goes.
Not at all. Not at all.
So
there's 2 more questions in the Q&A.
Let's see. Should I switch screen or I can get?
Should I just read it to you? Does that work?
I can pull it, but maybe I should stop the sharing so you can. So you don't have to stare at. Is this better? I don't know. Rather than just staring at the PowerPoint while we do the questions.
Yeah, no, it's great.
Okay, good. Yeah, so have religious programmers focused at all on the accessibility of the programs that they're developing? Open source projects can often be very inaccessible to people with disabilities or are not well designed with regard to universal design. I also wonder if you've seen the new show Devs. Not yet. A friend of mine keeps telling me to watch it and also insisting that he can't tell me anything about it. So he can't sell me on watching Devs because that'll give it away. So I know that I'm supposed to, but I haven't yet. Accessibility. I would have to go into the most active community by far is Crosswire, and I bet you anything they've done a little bit there. I haven't noticed anything on a quick first pass, but that's something to look at because the Evangelical Project does have this dimension of having kind of universal scope, right? So I'd have to look at that and see if there are any kind of interesting framings for thinking about accessibility in a kind of theological light. So thank you for that. Do we observe efforts like this from other religions? I've personally been connected with Quakers and Baha'is. Quakers do not claim sacred texts, but of course there's plenty of content regarding the principles of Quakerism. I'm not sure. I've mainly kind of focused on Christian Bible software, which already gets me into hot water just because there are all these kind of denominational questions that I gloss over, especially also when I've done work on sermons. There's so many different forms of sermon authorship, and the circulation of sermons varies from church to church. So it's been hard enough just kind of holding on to Christian as a framing device. And my logic for doing even Christian is that the software programmers actually, Logos specifically has different denominational sub-packages addressed to different denominations with different materials attached to them. So programmers, the major commercial programmers specifically try to be non-denominational and have as wide a reach as possible. But of course, they're still working within Christianity. Outside of that, I'd have to look, there's decent amount of literature on Islam, digital Islam, and looking at kind of, but again, a lot of the work in digital media and religion, kind of broadly construed, is just, it looks a lot at like, social media, virtual spaces, et cetera, forms of communion and other forms. And there are very few, there are very few even working in Bible programming that actually try to think about the technologies themselves and their implications. So this is just to say, there may be other efforts in other religions that are like this, but they are not yet on my radar. But it'd be something to look for. I've done a little bit more of that just broadly in terms of like copyright in other religions or trademark in other religions. You can see those are interesting, but I haven't looked at, because the Bible software thing is just one little new exploration. I haven't had the chance to position it more broadly. So, okay. Okay. So to what extent does Crosswire accept new content? From the way you described folks submitting sermons, it feels like it could devolve into something like Medium, but for religious content. Yeah. So that was the one. Yeah. So that was kind of that's what I started looking for, is when I thought about open source religion. Was there something like that was so sufficiently open source, right, in terms of its input and collaboration, that theologically speaking, there is no center there, right? It could take all comers, and it would be really kind of, there have been some, so Crosswire doesn't really do that. Basically, when they're accepting additional material, it's relatively clearly funneled in terms of, here's material for users in terms of commentary and user-generated material, and it's kind of separate from the commentaries and sermons and the central database. So I guess there's less of a risk of having open source technologies facilitate like a wiki religion, right? We're just, so yeah. I feel like I have a couple citations where people have looked at explicitly kind of wiki projects, but they've always been so marginal, right? Like really weird. I believe, yeah, anyway, Sinreich, someone who does work on copyright, has written about, I'm not going to say any of the words because I'll get it wrong. But anyway, there have been a couple different little experiments there. But Crosswire, no, I'd say they still kind of patrol their content sufficiently.
Yeah, Aram Sinrek, I think.
Yeah, Aram Sinreich. Yeah, it's something like Bokanism or something like that. He has a piece that was kind of like a wiki. But anyway, Anyway, Zahn, religion continues to be at the foundation of these technologies. I'm intrigued by this assertion, and I think you're right. Historians of science are loath to admit, for instance, that Newton wrote way more religious material than scientific, and display a reluctance to admit that spiritual and theological concepts can be central to the production of scientific knowledge. Today, we're seeing a resurgence of spiritual importance in knowledge production in science as indigenous science and non-Western science become prominent lines of inquiry. Isn't it strange we're so willing to accept non-Western and non-Christian spiritual influence and natural knowledge than we seem to be for Christianity? Thanks for sharing this work. Can I copy that text for later? I don't know if I may not have talked to you, Zahn, about this, but I have a grant which may or may not, given the circumstances and state budget crises, I might not get access to that money. But I had a grant, presumably starting next year, to look specifically at spiritual innovation. In other words, the spiritual origins, and it was going to look at neurofeedback devices and different forms of kind of biotechnologies from the 60s and 70s on, and then neurofeedback's kind of uptake in marketing analytics and that kind of stuff. So looking at patents, but also like grounding it in kind of spiritual experimentation in California in the 60s and 70s, cybernetics and stuff. So anyway, this is all just to say, yeah, I think there is a lot more to be said about the role that religion plays in certain forms of knowledge production. Whether that's innovation is the new one that I wanted to interrogate. But also, it doesn't just have to be that. So it's a strand that it's probably a strand that I'm just beginning to think about, but would love to have it be the thing for me for the next few years as I get bored of copyright. So we'll see. but I've also been doing trademark, but anyway. So yeah, thank you for that, Zon.
I have kind of a follow-up question. First of all, thanks for your talk. It was totally awesome.
Oh,
Really,
thanks, Mike.
really, yeah, super enlightening.
Thank you.
Which is, of course, I guess a loaded term to use in this sense. Scene. So I was like, I love Chris Kelty's work as well, and I'm super curious whether you read that prior to doing your study, and it was sort of like a framing way that you were thinking about these online communities, or whether you stumbled on it afterwards. And then
yeah,
I'm also wondering, like, if Kelty kind of generates some questions for you around the quality, the sort of characteristics of the communities you're studying. I'm curious kind of like what questions your work might generate for people who study online communities that aren't necessarily, don't claim that religious background.
Yeah. So for me, always, even with the copyright stuff, religious organizations to me are, I mean, I find it interesting to locate that as a place of study because their affinities are so explicit and they're part of their their identity making. So there's a way that the affinities and the things that I see in religion are just more explicit, but they're happening in other forms of social community and affiliation. So to me, religion just becomes this exemplar for a certain type of explicit kind of social relation with others. So so to me, and it's like, so in terms of chronology, I don't I'm not sure which came first. It was relatively, because this stuff I started working through at the end of my dissertation. And then he came to visit UC Davis just as we had our first baby. And so I remember talking to him and being totally incoherent. So anyway, so it kind of co-developed. And seemed particularly resonant. And only because of this presentation, I went back and to read more Kelty, and I had totally forgotten he has a whole chapter on the product. The next chapter is the Protestant is thinking about the Protestant Reformation as a metaphor and model for these communities, and that. So anyway, that just made me think there's well, I don't know what to do with that other than that Kelty has continued to be generative. Personal question.
I have a question. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I have a question that's maybe just kind of a little bit of a provocation. So you talk about the religious open source community of programmers being a recursive public in Kelty's terms, and the nature of a lot of the projects you discussed as being explicitly evangelical. And I'm just wondering if there's kind of a harder materialist argument to be made there about the role of computational media in kind of producing the modern flavor of evangelism, or computational media and evangelism being kind of co-constitutive of each other? Or do you think that is like taking that line of argumentation too far?
Yeah, in other words,
like kind of the medium is the message kind of thing, like the ability to propagate and share these texts and do this kind of computational exegesis, is that part of what is like at the core of the rise of evangelism?
Yes. I mean, so you could say, so I guess this book, I forget his first name, but Syker wrote a very recent book called Liquid Scripture, which was a little bit more. So he's kind of making the argument that these certain forms of Bible software are constitutive of a watered down and individualistic form of kind of contemporary religious practice, with Bible apps. And it's a little bit kind of like grumpy old Manny, so I'd have to think about like a better, but I'm very partial to materialist. I start with technologies, and I start, with the copyright stuff, I start with the kind of the legal mechanisms as themselves kind of foundational and a priori to the social organizations they foster. So a lot of the copyright stuff was looking at, the control of the text came first. And that capacity to control was a way to create different kind of nodes of community by patrolling who was reading it, who got the text, what interpretations were available to them, et cetera. So I'm very partial to that kind of more materialist approach. Again, like all STS stuff without being deterministic or, but I'd love to, and I do think that's where I'm trying to distinguish myself from some of the couple other kind of historians of this space that I think are just interesting in recounting the history and also maybe kind of criticizing the technology, which I know is not what you were saying, but like, yeah, so yeah, I'd be interested in trying to figure out how to make that argument in a way that I'm satisfied with. Yeah.
Can I bounce off that?
Yeah, sure.
Also, because well, thanks so much for talk. Great talk. Something about Anissa's question like just brought you to life. I don't know if you, but like I don't know. Yeah, it's. And I was gonna ask something.
Oh, you got muted.
I hear you making an argument about kind of like it's an explanation for some of the computational skill and capacity that might exist in the humanities, right? That here's like an early way in which it's developed out. But the capacity argument isn't exactly a social shaping argument, right? And I think that's what Anissa is asking you. Like, either did this, like if you were telling like a conventional story, which I don't think you are, but like the conventional social shaping arguments might be by translating all these texts into this particular sort of digital format with all the tagging and so on, that had some kind of shaping consequence on the way that what was being discussed, how it was being discussed, like the very content of the religious text. Or, like maybe you would have gone the other direction and said something like, this had a significant impact on the shape of text mining and data analytics. Humanities.
Which I couldn't quite, I didn't feel comfortable doing. I felt like that's what I was promising in my abstract. And I was like, no.
Okay, but like take the opportunity now, like, I don't know, you're not in the talk now, you're in the Q&A. So I'd be curious to hear either direction or other directions.
If I may just interject, we're just at the 1 hour period. So anyone who does need to leave, just thank you for coming, and anyone who wants to stay around for more talk with more chatting with Andrew, please do, because it will definitely continue.
Yeah, thank you.
And before you answer that, I also will say we typically edit the Q&A out of the video that gets posted online. So if you want to feel free to just like run with that question.
Yeah. Well, so what we're getting at here, I think, is so there are two things going on in what I've presented that I'm trying to integrate, but they were both written at different times and are doing slightly different things. Which is the second part is a little bit more about is a little more technological determinist, and that these kind of projects of developing technology themselves are constitutive of open source religion, which is a form of affinity amongst the programmers and potentially users. But then there's also the continuities thing that I've written later, which is, look, there are traditional forms of computation that preceded the application of computers. There are traditional forms of organization, collecting, and collating. So I guess this is to say that you're pressing on what are two different parts that are different historical arguments, and that are featuring technology in a different way. And I think the key is going to be figuring out the way to really integrate those two in a way that's meaningful. Because the first portion is like the technologies we're developing, there is a natural affinity there. So whatever that means, there are continuities, right? There's a natural affinity between the labor of old school, monks processing and analyzing the text and new technological capacities. And then the open source thing that comes later is a little different. So anyway, this is, I think what you're getting at is what I have to resolve to get this to really have legs, you know. And it gets back to Zahn's question. It's like, what's the role of religion, right? You know, what that's the thing. And I want to do it without resolving, you know, I want to do it while maintaining the tension, of course, without just saying technology was there and they found religious uses, or conversely, technology resulted in new religious practices. But yeah, that's all stuff that that I get to think about more.
Yeah, that's a good project to have. So
Yeah, thank you. So I can do, I can continue with the Q&A. So Leah, how did I first learn that it was possible to copyright religious text? That was, well, it's interesting. So it actually doesn't have, you know, so I talked about the tension between control and evangelicalism, and it actually had much more to do with an interest in kind of unilateral copyright over kind of much more closed communities. So Scientology, certain esoteric practices that involved careful control of materials. So that goes way back to when I was doing a master's in media studies. If you want to go personal, it was a partner of mine who was involved in esoteric practice, and she wanted to share the worksheets that she was getting, but they were copyrighted, and she got reprimanded for allowing me to see them. So that was always like, that was kind of an initiation. And then I looked at various spiritual practices that involved manipulating or circulating text in different ways. And so, but it kind of started from that. It's always been a focus on textual distribution before copyright, and copyright has become a mechanism that I started to pay attention to. But it's about the movement of media, you know, as a media studies person. So is there a self-selection in the material that makes itself available for digitization and analysis? For instance, how does a sermon from Pastor Joe and wherever make its way into the data pool? Yeah. So the circulation of sermons in these different spaces is something that I'd have to decide if I have the words to really explore. I've talked to people about this, and there are so many different, just the sermon thing is just so complicated. It's hard to, and it's what I started with, was thinking about the circulation of sermons in particular. But so some practices just have notes, right? And they circulate their notes, they put them online. For a while, there was a organization out of Kent State that located and organized every publicly available sermon database. So there was some stuff that was just being put out there. And even some celebrity pastors like Rick Warren have been explicit about they don't license through like a Creative Commons license or anything, but they've been explicit about saying they're not claiming ownership over their sermons. And in fact, these sermons should circulate in whichever way is suitable for evangelical projects. So there's always a capacity to get access to sermons and sermonic material. Then there's also, you know, non-copyrighted Bible translations like the King James, and historical commentaries that have been really influential and have fallen out of copyright. And those have become, just like in early DVD times when you could always get a DVD of A Night of the Living Dead because it hadn't been properly copyrighted. Some of these copyright, you know, some of these commentaries just circulate in all the software because they're publicly available. And then people criticize that because they're theologically not very nuanced or really old. So anyway, this is just to say there are a lot of different points of entry for sermons. Desperate Preacher, I don't know. For a while, I was looking at some of those databases, and they would contract with sermon writers, and you know, and then it was a subscription service. So there have been lots of different economic models and modes of circulation. So I try and point to that without getting too much into the weeds because it's super complicated. But and some don't have notes at all, right? A lot of sermon traditions are extemporaneous, and some are scripted and part of a liturgy. So it's very complicated. How does all of this intersect with colonial motivations for religious propagation? Yeah. So yeah, the Evangelical Project, right, is also aligned with a missionary project and efforts to get texts and translations into the hands of others outside of the U.S. So there is a story to be told there, and I guess I'd have to look at it more closely to really think about it. It's probably a component of certain Bible software projects. Absolutely. They make it very explicit in their materials that there are evangelical components to it, that there are efforts to convert, et cetera. A lot of the Bible apps, are explicit about that. So linking that to kind of colonial histories of the propagation of this material would be the next step. And yeah, I'd have to look to figure that out. But it'd be interesting. I think there would be connections there. And then Zahn, another reason studying religion is so fascinating is that the relationship to expertise can be both clear and also complicated, but most crucially changing. The pastor or priest has a kind of expertise, but everyone has their individual relationship to God that's mediated through practice, text, and thought. Yeah, so and then maybe we can wrap up. So as Zahn, you probably know, I've looked at authorship rather than expertise as the motivate, right? So how conceptions of authorship, if they're not grounded in originality, still are, so there's the labor of the priest with the word and the relationship they have with their congregation, all these kind of inalienable things that inform sermon authorship without it being traditional authorship. And you could probably say a similar thing with expertise, right? And, the way that religion might construe expertise is going to have less to do with the individual, but it's going to have to do with recognizing and channeling inspiration and things like that. So it'd be really interesting to interrogate, what does religious expertise mean? Whereas prior to this, I've just thought about religious authorship. But anyway, there'd be an interesting story there. So
May I sneak in one quick question?
Yeah.
So what would you say if someone asked you to define historically the main application or the main function of religious computing? Has it been search?
I'd say, just off the top of my head, again, so the periodization is hard, so I'm thinking, but I would say what it's leading to is, it's at least when it comes to the Bible as kind of as the text, the Bible is, rarely read linearly. It's often, it's used for guidance. It's used as a kind of foundation for sermons. It's used as it's routinely incorporated into practice in ways that no other book is, right? So Bible software, to me, is permitting or facilitating a certain type of maneuvering through a text that you just don't do with traditional literature, right? The religious actors have always accepted that the Bible is something that you interrogate and explore in asynchronous, in nonlinear ways, and try to find connections across passages and try to find divine or spiritual meaning, like spiritual signal across. And there's like extreme versions, like the Bible Code, right? Remember the Bible Code, where they search for prophecy in arrangements of text in weird ways. So there's this assumption that meaning can be buried and it's non-literal, and it's not just uncovered through straightforward reading. So Bible software, to me, is always trying to replicate or engage with unconventional reading practices that the Bible has always kind of attracted. So
yeah, that makes sense.
That's a really good question. I think I could write a paragraph to put in the intro there. So, yeah.
Great. Okay, well, I
Thank
guess
you.
we should wrap it up.
Yeah, thank
Sound
you. This
good?
was a really fascinating talk.
Yeah, well,
Learned
thanks
a
so
lot.
much. Yeah, I really appreciate you guys having me here in these circumstances. And it's, this has been kind of like a, you know, a lodestar I've been looking forward to give myself to focus on research in the middle of lots of
Nice.
nonsense. So it's been really nice psychologically and, you know, academically. So I really appreciate it.
We appreciate you joining
Thank
us.
you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
It's been great.
All right.
Okay, thank
Take
you.
care.
Thanks.